there will be every effort to try to bring us back to October 6th.
Yeah.
And I think our job as Palestinians and allies is to make sure that there's no return to October 6th, because October 6th was already colonial and oppressive and all of the things that we know, and genocidal in a way, in the sense that the genocide was the logical culmination of Zionism.
Well, if you'd like to begin by introducing yourself.
Well, my name is Tareq Baconi. I am Palestinian. My grandparents are from Haifa and Jerusalem. And I grew up between Amman and Beirut. And I'm a writer living in London at the moment.
Okay, nice. So this conversation is going to, at the beginning, center on the idea of displacement and how it shapes Palestinian identity. And so my first question is really, obviously as Palestinians, we know that tragedy and displacement is a huge part of our history. And so I'd just like to begin by asking you, if we just keep a focus before October 7th, just generally, not keeping the genocide in mind, what role has displacement and, I guess on a more positive, tone, return played in your identity and generally the identity of Palestinians growing up?
Well, I think it's central. I think Palestinian identity post-Zionism is one of displacement. If you think of Zionism as the ideology that's looking to create an empty land in Palestine and has succeeded in creating the colony, the settler colony, the state of Israel, then displacement for Palestinians has been something that has been a part of their identity since the first Zionists landed on Palestinian shores. And as a correlate to that, it's also return becomes the sort of, as you say, the opposite of displacement and central to our identity, our sense of self, our political imagination, how we live in our futurity, what kind of lives we imagine for ourselves. So, for me personally, I think it manifested in different ways. I grew up in Amman, as I said, and my grandparents, so I have a bit of a convoluted history talking about displacement. My grandparents were ethnically cleansed in 48 to Lebanon. And not a lot of people know this, but between 48 and 51, the Lebanese government used to naturalize Christian refugees because they were playing with the demographics of the country. They wanted to create a Christian state that could be allied with the Zionist state. And so my grandparents got Lebanese citizenship. My parents were born and raised Lebanese, and then they fled during the civil war to Amman. So that idea of displacement, being Palestinian but also being Lebanese, but also growing up Jordanian, this constant recreating of oneself and recreating of one's family through displacement, through refugee status, I think is something that is central to who I am today and to how I think about my Palestinian identity. Funnily enough, because of the particular experience of Amman, of Jordan, of many Palestinians being naturalized, obviously not all, because there's a lot of refugees in Jordan that don't have citizenship. The idea of return is not as burning as if you're a refugee camp, if you're living in a refugee camp in Yarmouk or Tell el-Za'atar, or if you're exiled into the West. I think the way that return shapes daily life is more pressing and is more felt because of obviously the need to return. But for me, return was always something that was aspirational, that it was a right. It wasn't necessarily driven by an immediate existential need.
I mean, I'd like to touch on that now specifically because in your book that you've just released, by the time we release this episode, up here and down here for the cameras, you recount these stories that you just kind of briefly touched on of your grandparents and of your parents fleeing Palestine and Lebanon, respectively. The people listening to this to the podcast, mainly a Western audience, and so maybe they'll understand this idea of generational trauma to some extent. They'll understand what it is, but maybe they won't understand kind of the details and the specifics of it. And so how do you weigh up each kind of displacement? Do they all kind of feed into the same thing, or are they different from one another?
I think it's a really good question. I think it took me a long time to understand the concept of intergenerational trauma because I had a relatively happy upbringing, as a relatively happy childhood in Amman, and so I never would have thought of myself as traumatized or as someone who carried trauma with them. But actually in adulthood, reflecting back, I can see how displacement shaped my grandparents and shaped my parents in very different ways. So I was raised mostly by my maternal grandmother, who was living at home with us. So my parents obviously raised me, but my maternal grandmother was a formative figure in my childhood. And for her, I think her trauma manifested in silence. You know, she would talk about Palestine in fleeting ways, but what was important was what she didn't say, you know, the silences that existed around our childhood. And it was only later in life when I understood being Palestinian as a political identity, not just as an identity of being, that I started talking to her about return and about the Nakba and about what it meant for her. And it all came out, you know.
She was open about it.
She was open about it. She would talk about it, and she would be emotional about it. You know, the first time I went to Palestine, she was terrified. And I realized that her terror was about thinking of me among Zionists, because that was her last experience of being in Palestine. And so I think her trauma was very much ever present, but almost untouched. It's almost like it was frozen in time. Which also meant that she didn't really talk about return, because she almost didn't allow herself the fantasy or the permission to imagine what return could look like, or that it, you know, she couldn't quite face another disappointment. Mm-hmm. For my parents, it was completely different. And I think, I mean, that's one of the strands in the book, is my mother's anger, which I, as a child, I didn't understand. And it took me a long time to understand her rage as a rage against systems of oppression, against displacement, against injustice, in the sort of the macro sense of the political world we live in, but also in the micro sense, in terms of the patriarchy, in terms of growing up in a conservative society, in terms of her being a very political being, an actor that wanted justice, wanted return, being a woman who was sort of leading activist circles in Lebanon, that was also made smaller by the patriarchy. And that rage, the way it manifested, the way it shaped my childhood, I understand today as part of that trauma, as part of that sort of festering injustice.
Mm-hmm. And so, well, with everybody having their own kind of stories of displacement and everything, it can obviously lead to quite a fragmented individual through lots of different, well, we've used the word trauma a few times already, a few different traumas to kind of have to deal with, to grow up with, to understand as you kind of shape your own identity. How does this, on an individual level, then affect the collective? How is a society born on such a, I guess, an unstable route?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it is unstable, because it is a way of being that is facing a force that is by design aimed at fragmentation and displacement. So our fragmentation is the outcome of Zionism, and it's constantly iterated and reiterated, and we're constantly broken up into smaller communities, into smaller geographies. And the fact of our dispersal means that someone can grow up in Chile and someone can grow up in the refugee camp in Yarmouk, and both of them can be Palestinian but have nothing in common. So I think that fragmentation is real, but I also think that the imagination of return and the sense of belonging to a political project that is bigger than us, that is, you know, Palestine as this piece of land that was colonized, and that is still in our political imaginary as a place that we will return to, this idea of justice and refugees, is something that binds us as well. And I've been thinking actually a lot about this recently, about how Palestine is also a political project that transcends Palestine. You know, if I think about myself as Palestinian, then obviously I'm committed to the return of the land. But I'm also committed to fighting injustice beyond Palestine, and thinking about how that manifests. You know, you as a Palestinian, I think, you become intimately aware of systems of oppression and what they do and how they manifest and how insidious they are. And so I think there's this sort of bigger, you know, for all of our fragmentation, there's this bigger container or bigger envelope of Palestinianness, I think, that can hold us even in our diversity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, connecting. I mean, you've spoken a bit how we can, the things that link us and the things that separate us in this sense. But I mean, if we speak about how Israeli propaganda then plays a role in all of this, because obviously we've all been subjected to it in some way or another. And to some extent, they will just kind of say that everybody, for example, now in the genocide is Hamas, blah, 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 as a way to justify just annihilating everything. But how would you say that Israeli propaganda generally has had an influence on Palestinians? Because especially between the river and the sea, so to say, in 48 or in the West Bank, where Palestinians are all together and in a Palestinian society, how does this system of oppression, along with what they say about us, how does that influence then the Palestinian psyche?
I think it influences it a great deal. I mean, I think, listen, we are not existing in a vacuum. We exist very much as humans in engagement and interaction with ideologies, with ecosystems, with communities. We're relational creatures. And so the fact that there is this force that is imposed at Palestinians that has shaped every aspect of Palestinian life means that we have had to identify ways of survival around that force. You know, just even in the basics, think about someone who is struggling to maintain their residency permit in Jerusalem as versus someone who's a 48er who has Israeli citizenship. The ways we relate to just the mundane realities of being on the legal sense shapes how we interact in the world. So I think Zionism has obviously shaped Palestinians and how we relate and identify in this world. And there's another element which you were touching on, which is this idea of propaganda. The Hasbara, Zionist Hasbara, is not only powerful because of how much resources the Zionists put in it, but it's also powerful because much of the world has bought it, and maybe not the global majority, although increasingly, some countries in the global south, but Western powers certainly have bought it. And so Palestinians also exist in the West, we're speaking in London, exist in the West in a way that is against the grain and oppositional. If we're not erased, then we're demonized. And so we're either invisible or we're hypervisible, and hypervisible in a negative connotation. And so you learn to exist. I always think that our identity as Palestinians is not a neutral identity. You can't just be Palestinian. You're Palestinian and, there's your identity, who you are, is immediately politicized based on the frame in which you exist. And so I think that has obviously shaped us as people. But one of the things that I think a lot about, this idea of being shaped by Zionism, how important it is for us also to consciously break out of that imposed frame and, try to reclaim our Palestinianness outside of the frame of Zionism. And that's not to say, we want to go back and recreate Palestine as it existed before the Nakba, because that's not going to happen. But how do we take what existed before the Nakba and project it into post-Nakba, into post-Zionism? What kind of Palestine would it look like then? And so there is a sense of continuity that I feel like politically we should try to reclaim outside of any kind of engagement with or thinking about Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, you said there that our identity is inherently political. I mean, I can just touch on one thing where I remember I was at a party once and I told somebody, I'm originally Palestinian, and this person just said, I don't want to speak about politics now. Right. And it's really like, I didn't mention anything about politics, I just said where I'm from.
You didn't have to. Your identity is a political identity.
They just eat it up, and as you said, it's the Western world has eaten up this propaganda machine that the Israelis have spread, I guess, and it's led down to the individual person. And I guess on that note, on the individual person is, I guess, what I'd like to ask you about next, because you mentioned in your book the idea of the exile of the authentic self. Could you explain a bit about what that means to our audience, and in some ways, if it's linked to these generational struggles that we've spoken about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that I think all of us as Palestinians, but also as humans generally, struggle to hold the whole of ourselves, as in there are so many paradoxes within who we are, and so many different ways of being, so many different loyalties, so many different loves and communities, that sometimes it's hard to hold hold ourselves whole. That's how I like to think about it. And so I think this is something that's not specific to me. I think it is something that is universal. But for me, in how I was relating to it in the book was in talking about queerness. You know, growing up as a queer individual in a homophobic society, I felt like there was no way for me to present myself fully or to be present in the whole of myself. I always exiled parts of myself in order to fit the community. And, you know, growing up in Amman, for me, it was remaining closeted, so not coming out as a queer individual and putting on this mask, this charade in terms of how I presented myself to the community. So internally, and this is obviously in reflection and in adulthood and in the future, sort of looking back at my childhood, it looked like there was an authentic self that I was excising, you know, or erasing, because I felt like there was no way for it to exist in the world. And so I think a lot of my struggle today as an individual is how to not try to shrink myself in order to fit frames or assumptions that are imposed on me. And that is as much about me being a queer individual as it is about me being Palestinian, as it is about any set of other identities. And sort of it's the owning of one's full humanity in all of its complexity.
And how does that then manifest? Do you think it manifests itself on, I guess, a societal level? Can we really, I guess the broader question is, can we say that Palestinian identity and society is one monolithic thing?
I mean, no, and it shouldn't be, right? I mean, this comes up often, and sort of going back to one of your earlier questions, you talked about this fragmentation, the fact of our displacement, that we become all these different stories. And there's obviously a tragic element to that, because the Nakba has done this and imposed fragmentation. But there's also a beautiful element to that, which is that we are a diversity of stories. And there isn't any people that's monolithic. And I think there's strength in understanding that there is, in this diversity, great unity as well, that, you know, however we come to our Palestinianness, that there is this thing that unites us. And so I just think that oftentimes we fall in the trap of thinking, oh, actually, you know what, we're not united as a people, or we're too fragmented. And I always think to myself, why sometimes this language sounds as if we want unity to be homogeneity. Yeah. But unity is not homogeneity. You know, you want diversity, and you want then in this diversity to have a convergence towards a certain, I don't know, in our case, political liberation project, to a sort of strategy. But you want diversity because peoples are diverse, and I think that's our strength.
Of course. I mean, you've kind of just touched on it there. I mean, because I want to touch now a bit on the political implication of all of that, because there are things that obviously, I guess 99% of Palestinians would agree on, but then there are things that are highly divisive and things that are very fragmented, political, I guess, ideologies that exist within society. And you mentioned unity a few times there as a society, because we have this, I guess, overarching goal. But when it comes to these divisive issues in society, how do we then use that unity in one place to then get past our differences in other places and kind of have and focus on the ultimate goal, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that we, and I'm talking here in the sort of the we as Palestinians, as sort of in a very generalized way, but I do think that we as a people have, over the course of the past 3 decades, lost our way. I think we went from being, on the political level, very clear about what our thawabit were, what our core pillars of liberation are, you know, return, full liberation of Palestine, river to sea. We're one people fighting one adversary, which is Zionism, and we're looking to decolonize Palestine. This is a very clear ideological and strategic infrastructure. And I think over the course of the past 3 decades, for various reasons which we don't need to rehash. We ended up confused, I think, again, on a political strategic level. With some people talking about partition and the two states, some people talking about, what would reconstruction in Gaza look like, as if that could be separated from the rest of Palestine. So there's all of these things that have become divisive. And in some ways, I think the only way to clarify is to go back and to sort of reclaim what is it that we're fighting for? Who are we? And I think if you talk to any Palestinian, regardless of what their political views is, instinctively, they know that Palestine from the river to the sea is ours. And they know that justice is return. And they know that for us, liberation means dismantling Zionism. These things are implicit, they're intuitive, they're not necessarily questioned. But there's a lot of political noise around them that then creates division. And so I think our work is actually political work, which is how do we resurface all of these commitments that inform who we are as Palestinians and use that to reshape and reignite and resuscitate our political struggle. And in some ways, this genocide has done a lot of that work, because now Palestinians are everywhere on the street talking about the Nakba and settler colonialism and genocide. They're not talking about let's build a two-state solution, right? And so the political momentum is there.
It's not a fringe anymore.
It's not a fringe, but it's also up to us to not sit on our heels and expect that this will then do its work. This is where you then build, or rebuild, I should say, a political liberation project, one that's able to harness all of that power and turn it into strategic victory.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I touched before a bit on how the Israeli propaganda has had effect on Palestinians and the way that Palestinians think and society generally. We've spoken a bit about the strategy of divide and conquer that Israel has used to kind of keep Palestinians in a certain way. Do you think that this strategy has almost changed in the way that they've completely thrown their toys out the pram in light of October 7th and the genocide now, and in the West Bank they've been setting everything on fire? Do you think their strategy has changed?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's to be seen. Listen, I think that there is a moment of reckoning after. I don't think the genocide is over. And I think that there will be a moment of reckoning, I think domestically within Israeli society at some point, with what they've done. And I think Israeli society today, and this is maybe giving them too much credit, but I think many people are just unaware of how genocidal their society has become, and of how brutally they carried out war crimes in Gaza. So I think there's a domestic element here, which is once the captives are sort of returned and the heat of the war, quote unquote, in their media landscape lessens, I think, and I hope that there is a moment of reckoning where they understand that they carried out a genocide, that their victims of genocide have become perpetrators of genocide. And so I think I'm curious about domestically how that manifests. But outside of that, and I don't for a second think that would really, that kind of reckoning would really challenge Zionism without work from the outside, without Palestinian work and without work from the global community. And so I think there will be every effort for Israelis and Zionists to try to reclaim the narrative. And what does that look like? I mean, the narrative of the past 2 years has completely moved them from being seen as a state that could deal with democracy protests for its citizens and still ingratiate itself with the region, completely take the Palestinians out of the equation, and present itself as a somewhat liberal democracy in the West or on the global stage, even though we all knew since 48, but certainly the decade before 2023, that Israel, the discourse globally was that Israel is an apartheid state, but somehow it was able to transcend that narrative. I don't think it can easily transcend that narrative today. I think that in many ways, the mask is off. People understand what Israel is. They've seen the genocide on their screens. So they understand it as an apartheid state. They understand it as an illegitimate settler colony. They understand it as a genocidal state. But look at the past week. You have politicians celebrating the ceasefire, going to Netanyahu, Trump having a speech in the Knesset. It's, Netanyahu is a war criminal that live streamed a genocide for 2 years, and somehow we're meant to unsee that and go back to a reality where politics is business as normal, with no accountability, with no justice. So I think there will be every effort to try to rehabilitate Israel's image. I think it's up to us to make sure that that doesn't happen, that you can't unsee a genocide. And so what do you do with that politically? Where do we take that politically? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, just on that note, I think in the last week I saw a member of parliament here in the UK, a Labour member of parliament, say that it's time to, I think he wrote an opinion piece in a newspaper here in the UK, and he said something along the lines of, it's time to reset our ties with Israel. This war has now meant that we should strengthen our ties, and that's what he was arguing in the piece, which is utter insanity.
No, but it's incredible, because this will their effort to rehabilitate their image will rest on that. Yeah. It will rest on people saying, it was a horrible war, but then we got all of the captives out. We have ceasefire. Let's reconstruct and secure the safety of Israel and go back to the two-state solution. There will be every effort to try to bring us back to October 6. Yeah. And I think our job as Palestinians and allies is to make sure that there's no return to October 6, because October 6 was already colonial and oppressive and all of the things that we know, and genocidal in a way, in the sense that the genocide was the logical culmination of Zionism, I think. And so we just have to stay in this openness of understanding what Zionism is and of making sure that we move that understanding towards accountability.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on that note, I'd like to touch on this, I guess, broader idea of where you think we are now, in a sense, where, if we believe that this ceasefire does hold, which at the moment doesn't really look that promising, but where do you see the Gaza genocide along with the other big historical events in Palestinian history, be it the Nakba or the Six-Day War or something like that? How do you fit it in the pieces?
Listen, I think the genocide has changed us as humans, not just as Palestinians. I think obviously the people who suffered the genocide, the survivors, the martyrs, but also people who witnessed the genocide and were completely helpless to stop it. I think this has changed us as humans, and I think it will take us a long time to understand how. And just as the Nakba changed, going back to our grandparents, just as the Nakba changed them and they carried that and that shaped how they lived in the world, I think the genocide will have the same effect on us, on our children. And I think it's in many ways the most significant milestone in Palestinian history. Obviously, there's the Nakba, which is the foundational sort of colonial trauma, but in terms of the numbers of martyrs, in terms of the scale of the destruction, in terms of the level of complicity of the global community in the genocide, I think I've been thinking and writing about this since before the genocide, about the centrality of Gaza, but obviously post-genocide, about how it's the epicenter of how we understand our global order. And it's not looking good. And so I think that this is a foundational period for Palestinians, but not only for Palestinians. And I think our job today is to, I think it's very hard to think about what doing justice for this looks like, but I think this is a responsibility we all bear.
Mm-hmm. So if we look at this in the lens of, because a lot of the people who listen to this will obviously be interested anyway in Palestine as a national liberation movement, and are on the streets protesting every few weeks whenever there is one in their cities, where do you see our position along this, I guess, continuum towards national liberation of the past 2 years? How have we where have we moved relatively to where we were? Is there like a path that we've moved closer towards liberation, or do you not like this idea that there's a path and that it's a very fluid?
Listen, I do think that there is fluidity in liberation movements, and I think things are not linear. I think that movements go forward and recede and go forward and recede, and they advance in ways that might not always be planned in a bureaucratic sense. But I do think that it's very difficult to speak of progress in the shadow of genocide, but I do think that there are things that have happened the past 2 years that are important and potentially aspects that foreshadow or presage victory if we play our cards right. The first is that we understand today how weak Zionism is. You know, we could have said that before, the cracks appearing in Zionism before October 7th. Israel would not have been able to survive the past 2 years without Americans and Europeans pouring inordinate amounts of support. And the cracks within Israeli society have never been stronger. Zionism has never been weaker, which sounds like a paradox given how horrifying their military power is. But ideologically, the state project is in question in a way that, with a sort of a sense of urgency that has never been felt since maybe its early years of founding. And so I think that's an important thing for us to politicize. And the second thing is that, and I mentioned this before, we are now talking about the fundamentals. We are talking about ethnic cleansing, genocide, Nakba, dismantling Zionism. We're no longer talking about all of the facade, all of the political diplomatic speak around partition and state building and all of that. And I think we have to hold that line. Any starting point talking about liberation has to start from this point. We can't go back to sort of what existed before.
But do you think, sorry, just to touch on that, do you think because in a political sense, maybe there's very few progressives which do advocate for one state basically instead of a two-state solution. How do we then, on the streets, so to say, move that conversation into the political sphere?
Yeah, and I think this is our political work. This is what we have to figure out in every policy engagement that we are in any kind of arena we are in. We always have to contest the legitimacy of Israel to continue to exist as an apartheid state. That is our political work, and I have to agree with you. I don't think that only the movement on the street will do that. I think as Palestinians, we have to resuscitate our structures of political liberation. If not the PLO, then what? If we can't take the PLO back to its revolutionary legacy, then what is an alternative political structure that we can all work towards? And I think that's but I want to talk about the third element that I think is really important, which is that now we talk about sanctions and embargoes, arms embargoes against Israel in a way that would have been unimaginable pre-2023. And, you know, we can't take that for granted. I think that Israel has to be a pariah state on the global stage.
Sure, definitely. But then what challenges do you think what challenges stand in the way of between here and there?
I think there are huge challenges. I think if there's anything, you know, the flip side of some of the things that I just talked about, you know, the weakness of Zionism is also seeing how much the Western world is invested in this colonial project, and how much this shows that the Western world hasn't dealt with its own legacies of colonialism and racism and empire. And so I think it's reckoning that actually one of the biggest challenges that's facing Palestinians today is that we're not facing Zionism as a standalone adversary. We're facing Western hegemony and its commitment to colonialism. And that's a huge challenge. And this is not something that only Palestinians will be able to confront. I think we have to work with allies, with other indigenous groups, with other decolonial struggles that are fighting this in order to liberate the planet. So we're talking about planetary liberation. But I think on the more immediate sense in terms of Palestinians, I think the biggest challenge is what we're already witnessing today, which is this huge political and diplomatic effort to try to get us to talk about reconstruction, the day after, governance in Gaza, how do you disarm Hamas? All of these elements are trying to put us back in the box where Palestinians are pacified and Israeli apartheid is unchallenged. And there's huge amounts of resources that's going into that, into creating that as a possibility. And even allies, if you think about Western states or even Arab regimes that are committed, so-called committed to Palestinian liberation, coming up with their support through the two-state solution shows how insidious, the fact that even Palestinians celebrate the recognition of Palestine, sort of not understanding that that's part of the equation to take us back to October 6th and what existed before. I think these challenges are enormous.
Of what's been in the news quite a bit recently, if we're speaking about challenges now, I just want to zoom in onto Gaza for a moment, has been the rise of proxy militias that are affiliated with Israel in Gaza. For example, Al-Shabaka or one of these other groups which Israel is now using to try and create a disorganized state within Gaza and to prevent Hamas from reaching its level of rule over Gaza as it was before. Because you've also written a book about Hamas, what importance do you give this new reality in Gaza with these rivaling militias working with Israel basically to knock Hamas off their perch or off the seat of Gaza?
It's frightening. I mean, I also don't think it's exclusively about Hamas. I think that this idea of creating security chaos is, a tried and tested colonial metric, and I think it's one that Israel has used very effectively historically among Palestinians, but even at present. Think about the Palestinian community in 1948. There's a lot of drugs and arms and disorganization and chaos that is injected into these communities. And that's a way of ensuring that Israel is then able to maintain domination. So if you think about it in the Gaza Strip, I think it's frightening because I think for many reasons. One is that, whoever's still in Gaza, the millions of people who are still in Gaza are survivors of a genocide. They need immediate security and help and humanitarian assistance and and humanitarian assistance and support. And there's a vulnerability that can very easily be weaponized, and that can pave the way for a different way of mass killing and mass extermination. The bombs might have stopped, but the mass killing will not stop if there isn't immediate everything given to the population, to the survivors of the genocide. And I think creating a situation of security chaos, designing it, manufacturing it amidst a population that's so vulnerable, I think is catastrophic. So there's that element. The second element is that this is a way for them to make a case for either Israeli or international troops on Palestinian soil, and to say that this is the only way we can protect these Palestinians in Gaza. So it becomes a cover for their colonial project. And the third, obviously, is to delegitimate Hamas. So to sort of turn Hamas out of being this, legitimate political actor in the Palestinian political ecosystem into something that's akin to these, gangs that are fighting and that are stealing humanitarian aid. The narrative which the Western media laps up is a very destructive narrative because it removes any sense of agency for Palestinians, sort of saying, this is land that a portion of the land that only Palestinians should govern until they can govern river to sea. But this is, and so all of that gets lost in the fray.
Mm-hmm. And so given amid all of this chaos that we're speaking about now, obviously Gaza is all but destroyed, millions of people displaced from their homes. Bringing this idea of return that we spoke a bit about at the beginning back into the conversation, what does it really mean now for the people of Gaza?
Listen, it's when the first ceasefire was announced earlier this year, and there were these pictures of thousands of Palestinians going back. That was modeling return, and obviously there's a very romantic way in which we can talk about this, which is sort of takes it out of the frame of real destitution and displacement and suffering now, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of romanticizing what we saw. But that was also modeling return, and these Palestinians were sort of going back to homes that they had just been displaced from several times. But this is in our political imaginary and even in our political work should be the return of them going back home to homes they had been expelled from in 48. And so I think everything around Gaza now is talking about the core of what Palestinians are demanding, which is that you don't displace and then get away with it and have a foreign power come and take over our land. We're talking about return. If just in Gaza for now, this has to be something that will foreshadow what return looks like beyond Gaza.
Is return the central part of, because for example, when we spoke to Francesca Albanese in our previous podcast episode, she spoke about healing once the genocide is done on both sides. Obviously, we shouldn't have to worry about what happens on the other side, but if we focus in on ourselves as Palestinians, how do we heal? How do we recover from all of this? Is return the central aspect of that?
I think so. I've been thinking a lot about return and writing a lot about return recently. And one of the ways that I sort of imagine return functioning within us as Palestinians and as humans is that even if physically we're unable to exercise it, how do we enact return on a daily basis? How do we enact return in our affect, in our politics, in our demanding for what's right, even if physically we're obstructed from delivering that? And I think that is where healing rests, this sort of deep-seated belief that something was taken from us and it's our right to claim it back, and to imagine it and to inhabit it, even if physically we're for different reasons by different people will be unable to enact it until it can be achieved on the collective. I do think that embodying return in whatever way on the individual, I think, is powerful.
Mm-hmm. And so what, if we again think about this from a post-genocide perspective, or at least where we are now, what lessons do we take with us from the past couple of years to ensure that we remain on this right path towards return ultimately?
I mean, I think we are going to be working through what the past 2 years mean for us for the rest of our lives.
Do you think the lessons will appear later then? Is it more of a focus now on the immediate situation, on the immediate chaos that we just spoke about in Gaza to ensure that?
I think that the focus should always be on the immediate situation. I think the focus should always be on ending the killing in Gaza. And not just in Gaza, the rest of Palestine, but as an extreme urgency in Gaza. So I think that should always be the focus. But no, listen, I do think that there are lessons that are already apparent. There's obviously going to be more understanding of what this period means for Palestinians and Palestinian liberation. Hindsight is
a wonderful thing.
Right. And so once we will be able to look at this, I always think about this as, could this moment in time, could it be traced back 20, 30 years from now and be seen as the beginning of our liberation, even with all of the horror that we've witnessed, that this is the moment in time in which Palestinians sort of got their act together, and sort of returned from this place of having been marginalized, of Israel appearing to be this incontestable power in the region, to literally Palestinians setting the world on fire, demanding justice. Could this be the beginning of our reorientation back into a path of liberation? I hope so. I think this is what I'm committed to, and this is my political project. And it would be the least in terms of paying the debt of martyrs and others in Gaza. But I think that will only be clear with time. I think we have agency to determine what this looks like, and I think it's about reclaiming that agency now.
From an analyst perspective, what do you think? Do you think there are lessons on kind of more of a geopolitical regional scale? Do you think there's things which have become a lot more apparent in the last couple of years? We've spoken a bit about how the West is throwing everything it can to try and rehabilitate Israel's image, but do you think that there are other things that we've learned that maybe we wouldn't have?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that many of us would have already understood this, but I think it's become clearer or more apparent. I think that if we're talking on the level of the region, geopolitically, one of the most important things is that regimes in the region now understand that Israel is not an ally, but a destabilizing force. You know, it's committed crimes against 6, 7 sovereign nations in the past 2 years, with zero accountability. So you have a state like Qatar that's saying we have an American base, we have the security guarantee, and the closest American ally carries out an attack and nothing. So obviously that has then shaped some of the American position towards the Gulf, towards the ceasefire. It's mobilized things, but I think there's a greater understanding in the region that Israel is an unstable force that will burn the region down in order to maintain its apartheid. I think if rulers in the region, I think people are smarter than rulers, and I think if people have understood this for years, but I think if rulers don't see that now and are not able to reshape their policies towards Palestine and Palestinians in a way that limits Israeli aggression, they will have a lot to pay.
And my final question sort of on this now of the genocide now basically is, what has actually changed for you personally? Because your book is a bit about your political awakening and so on, how does this now fit in? If you were writing the book in 10 years' time, how would you write about this period of time?
That's a big question. I mean, this book, Fire in Every Direction, I started writing in 2017. Okay. And there's no way I could have imagined it coming out at a moment of genocide. In some ways, it feels now like it's the product of another lifetime. Everything changed after the genocide, and not just for me, for everyone, I think. But for me, certainly, the grief and the anger, the level of disillusionment with the places that I consider home. You know, I live in London. The disillusionment with sort of this idea that there is. I could have always argued intellectually before October 7th about the colonialism of international law, its unfairness, its unjustness. But I would lie if I said I wasn't shocked by the level of complicity, by the way in which these claims to universality just lie in tatters, and to how far these states like the UK or the US, how far they would throw their own values under the bus in order to maintain a genocide. So I think there's grief, there's rage, there's disbelief, and I think I don't know how this has shaped me. Honestly, I've done a lot of writing around the genocide, most of it analytical. I haven't yet been able to find the words to capture the past 2 years because I feel like it's beyond what I can speak of now. I think I have to sort of wait and see. Once the urgency of the moment hopefully recedes, we get a minute of rest to see how this manifests. But right now there's grief, I think, more than anything. Yeah.
The final couple of questions, I just want to touch a bit on, because also in the book you write about how also being here during the time of the invasion of Iraq, how that woke you up a bit politically. And so I'd like to ask you to basically give some kind of call to action in a sense, like what is our role now here in the West, in the diaspora, also the people who aren't Palestinian but have become very aware of what's going on and have really woken up as well in the last couple of years to what has been going on for 78 years now. What is your call to action? What is our role? What is our role?
Well, our role, especially if we're talking about non-Palestinians, this isn't just about Palestine. I think, and I've said this before, but I think that the genocide is a global issue. It's not a Palestinian issue. The fact that this live stream genocide was permitted in the way that it was permitted means that it is only the first. There will be second, third, fourth instances of genocide elsewhere. Because what Zionism has done is to make permissible mass killing with no accountability. And that's not something that's going to stop at the borders of Palestine. This is going to transcend Palestine. So I think the question for us as Palestinians, but also as allies, is how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? What kind of world do we want to live in? Because I think Palestine is now at is the linchpin of the world. Through Palestine, we either move into a decolonial future or we move into a fascist one. And it's on us to determine what kind of world we live in. So if you're interested in climate change, if you're interested in refugees, if you're interested in immigration in the US, if you're interested in BLM, whatever your cause is, Palestine is central to that because it all intersects in terms of showing what kind of system of international law and multilateral governance we want to create, because the ones we have failed. And so this is the call to action. It doesn't have to come through Palestine or Palestinianness. It has to come through an investment in what kind of world do you want to be living in.
Sure. And I guess on that my final question on that note that you mentioned kind of now specifically more for non-Palestinians, but if we focus now on Palestinians in the diaspora, our ideas of return have always been a bit different to those who are in historical Palestine but haven't been able to go back to their lands, whether they're in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. How do we unify these two approaches to ultimately, these two ideas of return to ultimately bring a unified approach for all of us to return?
I think that we have to go back to the origins of our struggle. We have to remind ourselves, not to learn because we know this intuitively, we have to remind ourselves that in all of our diversity, we are one people. We're fighting in one struggle against one adversary. And I think there's a unity in that. I think my return will look different to your return, but I think on the collective, we're all looking to come back to this strip of land, whether actually physically or politically, in terms of getting justice, just in terms of reclaiming that. And so I think that's something that's unifying all of us. And I think it's important whenever there's noise, hasbara, political speak, diplomatic speak, to come back to this. And this isn't something that's new. I mean, look at any Palestinian protest. It's all there. River to sea, return, end Zionism. It's clear. Our struggle is clear. I think it's just figuring out how, not the what, but the how. How do you politicize that?
Well, thank you very much. That was everything. I think that's all we've got time for anyway. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.